quiet meal, a loud conversation, J.D. Vance pulled his car into the nearly empty parking lot of Red Maple Diner, a small, time-worn establishment nestled in the heart of Springfield, Ohio. The diner, with its flickering neon sign and well-worn facade, had seen decades of change, yet its inviting aroma of grilled burgers and freshly brewed coffee remained unchanged. It was a place that locals swore by, a hidden gem famed for its homemade meatloaf and hand-cut fries. After a grueling day of meetings, handshakes, and policy discussions, JD was looking forward to nothing more than a quiet meal before his drive home. As he stepped out of his car, he could already sense the diner's unspoken rhythm, a mix of warm nostalgia and the everyday hustle of hardworking people. The bell above the door jingled softly as he entered, and the cozy interior immediately wrapped him in a sense of familiarity. The walls were adorned with faded photographs of regulars and staff spanning decades, and the low hum of conversation was punctuated by the sizzle from the kitchen. Almost immediately, JD noticed something was off. The hostess behind the counter, usually quick with a friendly smile, paused when her eyes met his. Her initial greeting, "Good evening," was delivered with a hesitance that hadn't been there before. JD's tired smile wavered as he sensed the change in atmosphere. A few patrons glanced his way. One man, midway through his burger, leaned in to murmur to his companion, and a woman in a flannel shirt set her coffee cup down a little too forcefully. JD wasn't new to being the subject of scrutiny. He had learned long ago that not everyone welcomed a politician in their everyday spaces. Still, he hoped that a simple dinner could provide a respite from his public life. When the hostess finally returned from a brief trip to the back, her footsteps measured and her gaze troubled, she said, "I'm sorry, sir. We can't serve you tonight." Her words, though soft, carried a weight that silenced the diner further. JD's eyes searched her face for an explanation. There was no mention of a policy or a busy rush. The refusal felt personal, as if it were a judgment on his very presence. Around him, murmurs began to swell. The clink of cutlery and low voices created a backdrop of curious tension. JD took a slow, measured breath. Instead of reacting with anger or protest, he simply asked, "Could I speak with the manager?" His voice was calm, steady, a stark contrast to the charged air in the room. The hostess hesitated again, glancing toward the kitchen as though seeking permission from an unseen authority. Moments later, a man in his early 50s stepped out from behind a side door. Broad-shouldered and wearing a grease-stained apron, his name tag read Don. Don didn't offer pleasantries. Instead, he sized JD up with a critical stare. "I hear you got a question," he said in a tone that was more challenging than welcoming. JD met his gaze evenly, replying, "Yes, I'd like to know why you won't serve me tonight." Don exhaled sharply, a sound that carried both resignation and irritation. "Look," he began, glancing toward the modest crowd of diners who had paused to watch. "This isn't about any policy. It's about what people around here think. Folks in this community have long memories, and they've formed opinions about politicians, the promises made, the broken trust." His voice was low, yet every word cut through the quiet of the diner. JD's eyes drifted around the room. An older man in a worn blue work jacket, his hands scarred from years of labor, shook his head as he nibbled on his eggs. In a booth a few tables away, a younger man crossed his arms, his expression unreadable, but his eyes glinting with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. JD realized that this wasn't just about him. It was about the deep-seated mistrust of politics that had taken root here. "I get that," JD said quietly, nodding. "But tell me, Don, if I were just a regular guy walking in, not someone on TV or a name in the papers, would we be having this conversation?" He paused, letting his question hang in the air like a challenge to the status quo. For a long moment, Don said nothing, his gaze shifting between JD and the silent faces around them. Finally, he sighed and leaned against the counter. "People here feel like they've been let down time and time again. They remember every handshake, every promise that ended in disappointment. They don't trust that things will ever change." His voice softened just a fraction. as if confessing a hard truth. The diner had grown quiet, each sound amplified by the collective attention. JD carefully set his hands on the table, choosing his next words with care. I understand that. Believe me, I do. I grew up watching families struggle, seeing communities left behind. I entered public service with the intention to change that, not to play games. His tone was measured, earnest. At that moment, the young man in the booth, who had been silently observing, leaned forward and scoffed. So, you're saying you're different? That you actually care? The remark, though dismissive, carried the raw skepticism of someone tired of hollow promises. JD turned his head slowly toward the booth. I'm saying that I know what it feels like to be ignored, to be disappointed. I'm not here to defend every word I've ever said, but I'm here to listen and to learn. His eyes briefly met those of a young man, who looked away, his expression hard to read. Don's face, weathered by years of running the diner and dealing with the community's frustrations, showed a flicker of uncertainty. You always seem to talk about change, JD, but when it comes down to it, nothing really changes for folks like us, he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. The old man at the counter nodded in agreement, the clatter of his fork momentarily the only sound in the room. JD leaned forward, his voice steady, but carrying an undercurrent of vulnerability. What if I told you that I know exactly what that frustration feels like? I'm not here to make excuses. I've made mistakes, and I've seen the consequences of promises broken. I'm not expecting everyone to like me or even trust me, but I'm asking for a chance to prove that I'm listening. His words were soft, yet they resonated with the earnestness of someone who had weathered many storms. The tension in the diner seemed to shift as Don's eyes met JD's. There was a long pause, a moment where the weight of years of disappointment, skepticism, and hope hung between them. Finally, Don exhaled slowly and said, "All right, JD, you stay. Let's finish this conversation. And if by the end of it, I'm convinced that you're not just another talking head, maybe we'll serve you tonight." A murmur of surprise and even a hint of amusement rippled through the diners. The waitress, Mary, who had been watching the exchange with a mix of apprehension and curiosity, appeared moments later with a laminated menu in hand. She placed it in front of JD with a tentative smile. "We make our coffee strong here," she added softly, as if trying to break the tension. JD accepted the menu with a small nod, his eyes briefly meeting Mary's, a silent acknowledgement of the everyday struggles they all shared. As JD sat down at a booth, he wasn't really reading the menu. Instead, he watched the interplay of glances and shifting expressions around him. The old man resumed his meal slowly, the younger guy's earlier scoff replaced by a thoughtful silence. And even Don seemed to relax, just a little, his posture softening as he returned to his duties near the kitchen. JD took a sip of his coffee, its bitterness a reminder of both the long day and the raw honesty of the conversation. "So," he said, breaking the quiet, "what do you think I should do differently?" His tone wasn't defensive. It was more of a genuine inquiry, a request for insight from someone who had seen both sides of the coin. Don looked at him for a long moment, his eyes revealing the weariness of years dealing with the community's pain. "People here, they see you as a promise. And every time a promise isn't kept, they lose a bit more of their faith. I can't say it's all on you, but it sure feels like it sometimes." His voice was gruff, yet laced with an undeniable honesty. The younger man in the booth, who had been silently contemplating, finally spoke up in a low voice. "They think you talk about the working class, but you're still playing the same political games. How do we know you're any different?" His challenge cut through the air, raw and unfiltered. JD leaned back slightly, absorbing the words. "I can't promise perfection," he replied quietly. "I can only promise that I'm trying to be better, to do more, to not forget where I came from." His eyes swept the room, meeting the skeptical gaze of the young man, the resigned nod of the older man, and the cautious curiosity of Mary and Don. A heavy silence fell again, this time softer, more reflective. The diner, once a stage for confrontation, now felt like a space where real dialogue was unfolding. The clatter of dishes resumed as orders were placed, and the murmur of conversation returned gradually, infused with a new undercurrent of possibility. After a long moment, Don spoke again, his tone less combative and more reflective. You know, JD, this town remembers every handshake, every word of promise. And sometimes it takes a lot more than words to make that trust worth something. He paused, then added, maybe tonight you'll get a meal. And maybe tomorrow, people will start to believe you're more than just another politician. JD smiled, a small, sincere smile that reached his eyes. I appreciate that, Don. Really, I do. He picked up the menu again, not so much to order as to absorb the quiet determination that filled the room. Outside, the neon sign flickered on, and the scent of grilled burgers mingled with the aroma of strong coffee. In that simple diner, amid the clinking of forks and the low hum of renewed conversation, J.D. Vance wasn't just a politician or a headline waiting to happen. He was a man willing to listen, to understand, and perhaps, in that brief exchange, to bridge a gap that had long divided a community from its leaders. As the evening wore on, the conversation continued in hushed tones, small debates, shared memories, and even tentative hopes for a better tomorrow. And when at last Don called out, "Mary, get JD a burger," a ripple of quiet approval swept through the diner. The atmosphere had changed from one of confrontation to cautious optimism. JD took his first bite of the diner's famed cheeseburger, the flavors simple yet honest. And he couldn't help but think that sometimes change began with something as ordinary as a shared meal and a conversation that dared to go beyond the surface. Before leaving, he addressed the room softly. I know trust isn't built in a single night, but I'm here and I'm listening. And I promise, I'll work every day to be someone who truly represents all of you. The words hung in the air like a challenge and a promise. As the night wound down and JD prepared to leave, the diner slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Yet something had shifted that evening, an openness, a willingness to engage that went beyond the usual headlines. And for JD Vance, that was a small victory worth savoring.